Welcome back to the Unity Crash Course. Today I want to talk about something called prefabs. Now, if you've watched any videos or done any reading at all about developing in Unity, you will have heard of something called prefabs. That's what we're talking about today. Essentially, a prefab is a game object, a complete hierarchy of game objects that you can save and reuse. Let's look at an example. Let's go through a little example here. I have a little game that we'll be using in class here as one of the labs we're going to do. And in here, I have a little pause menu. Pretty easy, pretty straightforward. I just have it already hooked up. There's my pause menu. Let's investigate what's in the pause menu and how it works really quick. I'm just going to select it by clicking on it. And what have I got? I have got this is the word paused. And one of the things I like to do as I'm investigating how a scene is set up is I will use this little toggle right here to turn the object on and off and give me a better sense of what exactly I've got hold of here. And you can see this is clearly the word paused. And if I go up to its parent, that is the whole pause menu there. That's all connected with these buttons and this little gray background. That's all part of this object. And then above that is something called the game manager. So the game manager has on it as a child only the pause game. So the rest of the stuff is not connected to the game manager, it's just the game manager. Let's look then at what does the quit button do. The quit button, we look down here, has an on click, and that is communicating back up to the game manager that it wants to quit the game. So that is how this is all hooked up. The resume button is again connected to the game manager, telling it to set pause to false. We'll dig deeper into how buttons work and how UI is laid out in a later video. For now, the important thing to understand is that in order for the pause menu to function, we need this entire hierarchy of the pause menu, but it also must be connected through this mechanism right here to the game manager. So the pause menu will work as long as we've got the game manager and the rest of the hierarchy under there. So let's see it in action real quick. The pause menu is automatically hidden by the code within Game Manager. It is hidden on startup. And when I hit the escape key, it brings up the pause menu. It re-enables it. And since that is now enabled as an entire hierarchy, I have access to the buttons and I can resume, or I can presumably hit the quit button. Great, so that's my pause menu. The thing of it is though, this is only the start scene. This is the first scene of a multi-scene game. And I want that pause menu on all the scenes. So what I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna take this entire hierarchy here and copy that, and I need to paste it into the other scenes. And I can do that, right? Let's copy, and let's open the next scene, scene game, and don't save. And it needs to go on the canvas, so let's go ahead and paste it. Oh, I need to put it on the canvas. There we go. Done, right? Done. Easy. Great. And does it work? Let's see if it works. If I need to hit the escape key. Yeah, look at that. Good. Okay, so how is that a prefab? It's not a prefab. I didn't make a prefab. I just copied and pasted it. There presents a problem with this though. As you know from any time you've done programming, when you copy paste, a little flag goes up, little warning flag. Red flag, you're copying, pasting. That means if you've made a mistake or you want to make a change or a tweak, you now need to duplicate exactly that change tweak in every scene that you've pasted this into. Let's say, for example, I don't like that gray text on that pause word. let's change that. Let's go in here and let's just make it sort of a golden color, maybe more like the yellowish, kind of try to match the text behind there. In fact, you know what? Let's just match it. Let's just use this color right there. Okay, cool. Great, I'm happy with that. The problem now is if I go back to the other scene, it doesn't transfer that change over. Okay, so the solution to this is the prefab. Instead of doing a copy paste, I'm instead, let's go back to my game scene where I had that yellow that I liked. Instead of doing a copy paste, I'm going to grab the top of the hierarchy that I want. I want all of this stuff. I want all of this. So I'm going to grab from the top of where I want and drag it down into one of my asset folders. And you can see that I've created a prefabs folder in here. And when I drop, Unity will make what is called a prefab. You can see right there, it is called a prefab. It's going to name it automatically by the name of the thing I drug down, and that's a prefab. Now, what is a prefab? Let's click it. Let's just double click there, boop, and we open up the prefab, and we can see what is it. A prefab is Unity has saved the hierarchy of objects for us. Not as a scene, but sort of like a mini scene. It's not a full scene, it's just that part of the scene is saved, and we call that a prefab. To get back to my scene, I click right here, this little arrow to the left, I can go back to my scene. So that now is a prefab, and you can see it has turned it blue. The text has turned blue on here to indicate to me that is a prefab. Okay, so let's take this prefab, let's save my scene. Let's take this prefab and duplicate that prefab onto my other scene. So let's open up the start scene. And on here, I had one that I made by hand. I made by copy paste. I'm going to delete that. And instead, I want to put the prefab in. So I'm going to open up my little prefab, grab the one I want, and just drag it and drop it where I want that to be. And there you go. Now I've got my game manager, and as you can see here, it's got blue text indicating that it is a prefab. Let's change that prefab again in some way. How about we change the background here? The background color is too pale. I want that different. Let's find the background. I can start by doing my little clicky trick. Somewhere under here, and in fact, it is this. It's this right here is that background. So this is the color I want to change. Let's change it. I'm going to change it to match this little dark shadow right there. Okay, there you go, and I'm gonna say I like that. That's nice. Here's where things get a little tricky. Did I just change the prefab, or did I only change the instance of the prefab? Okay, you got about a 50-50 chance on this if you don't know. What I've done is not changed the prefab. I have only changed this instance that is in this scene. Okay, so if I go to the other scene, let's go ahead and save it, and let's go to the other scene. It did not affect that. So what if I wanted it to? I wanted it to, right? That's the whole point of doing a prefab. Let's take a look and see what I did exactly. I changed this color, and hopefully this is showing up on the video. I'll zoom this up for you. This color has got bold on it, and that indicates it is not at the prefab setting. So if you right click here, you can do, there are two options. One of them is apply this setting to the prefab, and the other is revert it back to the way it is in the prefab. So let's revert it back to the way it is in the prefab, and we'll see it back to there. So now let's go ahead and show how would I make that change to the prefab. And as you just saw, one of the ways was I just make the change here locally, and then I can apply that to the prefab. Another way I could do it is I can edit the prefab directly. We saw you can double click. Now I'm editing the prefab. Another way I like to do it is from the right click menu here in the game, there's a prefab submenu, and you can open the asset. Open the asset in context or open the asset in isolation. So let's do it in context. So there you go. You can access that way. And that now we are editing in this mode. This is prefab mode right here. We are editing just the prefab directly. So let's change the background of this to, I don't know, blue. Let's make it blue. Okay. And now I'm going to leave prefab mode, go back out to the scene. We see that this has affected my scene. Let's go to the other scene and check it. It has affected that as well because I affected the prefab. Now all of them have gotten that. A prefab is a hierarchical set of game objects with all their components and parameters saved that you can then reference into multiple scenes. And when you pull them in to multiple scenes, that prefab will be pulled in fresh each time that scene is opened. So if you change the prefab, you change it in every scene. However, you can alter the values in this in the scene version. This is an instance of a prefab here in this scene. You can change a value here in the instance, so you can override what's in the prefab. So like this is game scene, for example. When you do that, and you override a property from the prefab, it remains a prefab. All the other properties are still following the prefab, but this one is not following the prefab. It has been overridden, and the text there becomes bold. And I will then, you can just revert that back to the way it was. That use of prefabs is very powerful, and I use it extensively. Anything that you want to repeat in multiple scenes is a good idea to put it in a prefab. Let me tell you another trick about prefabs. This pause menu, maybe it only exists in one scene, but I suggest you make it a prefab anyway. Now the reason for that is that allows you to edit the prefab separately from the scene. So one person could be working on the background, right, and changing the colors of the background. Someone else can simultaneously edit the pause menu, and they're separate files now. The prefab is this file, and the background is in the scene, which is the scene file. So this is something that comes up very often when you're working on teams, and we are all trying to work in the same scene file. That can be really trouble, right? So don't throw everything directly in the scene file. Go ahead and put it in the scene file, but then just make a prefab out of it. And from then on, if you want to edit anything under this part of the hierarchy, you edit the prefab, and you don't have to check out the scene to make those edits. Let's talk about another thing that's pretty powerful with these prefabs. The quiz game has these two elements on it that are labeled. I just labeled them as prefab, the right prefab and the wrong prefab. And let's see, those are connected to these little prefabs. Let's take a look at what's in those game objects. I'm just gonna double click on the right prefab. The right prefab is a background and a text. That's it, just the word right here, the object right, and then it has in it a sub-object, which is the text. I'm using this object, this hierarchical pair of objects, to communicate the color that I like. I want this color for the background when the user chooses the correct answer, and the text I want to be this color. This color right here, I want that to be. So instead of entering the two colors, which I could have done, instead I made a mock-up of it. So I just made a separate scene and I mocked up the colors that I liked, and then I saved those as a prefab. And here's the wrong prefab. And that allows me to work in a very visual way. And now I can create these as prefabs. And what I can do in the game is I can refer to another game object. And that game object could be another object within the same scene, or it could be a prefab. If it's a prefab, then this other object, this right object and wrong object, they will be built in the game when I build because I'm referring to it. And it knows that I'm referring to it, so it knows to go get it when I do a build. But it doesn't instantiate those objects into the scene anywhere. There is no, when I hit go here, so this right object and this wrong object are not anywhere in the scene. They haven't been instantiated, but they are accessible within the code. Let's take a look at that code. Here we have the prefabs, and we use a prefab simply as a game object type. You just ask for the game object, and if you connect a prefab on there, then it isn't referring to a game object within the scene, it's referring to one of these prefab game objects. And let's see, how is that used? Okay, right here during startup, I just go through that game object and look at what's in its children to get hold of the color that I was referring to. So I just go through this object, treating it as if it were an object within the scene, even though it's not in the scene. And I can go through the whole hierarchy and pull out the image, and using the image to get the color, those colors that I specified. All right, so I'm going to call that the crash course on prefabs. The keys here are: a prefab allows you to efficiently copy and paste an item from one scene to another so that both scenes are referring to exactly the same hierarchy of objects with all their parameters. You can tweak the parameters that are on a prefab, and any changes you make here on the prefab will carry to all scenes that refer to that prefab. But at the same time, you can override parameters from a prefab to change them on a scene-by-scene basis. This does mean you need to be very careful when you're working with a prefab so that you know whether you are overriding the prefab properties or are you trying to change the prefab properties. So keep that in mind carefully as you're working with prefabs. Both of those things are legitimate things you might want to do. The other thing that you can do with prefabs is then refer to them in other game objects, like so. You can put this prefab right there, and that does not instantiate the prefab in the scene, but it does pull that object in so that it can be referred to in the code, complete with its full hierarchy and all its dependent objects. The textures, sounds, images, sprites, everything that it needed are there in the prefab. They're pulled in and accessible at runtime. And the last thing about prefabs, it allows teams to work efficiently by separating groups of objects off into separate files. These prefab files are separate files on disk. So if you edit one of those, you can do that without stepping on the toes of whoever's working on the scene that prefab may be in. Okay, that's prefabs, and I'll see you next time where we talk about code routines.